suggestions that we're talking about today will are not a substitute for medical care. That anything that you choose to do with your family member or anything you choose to share with friends or family members, please share that they should always work in concert with their primary care provider, because this is a medical condition. Again, today we're talking about holistic ways of managing, but that doesn't mean that if you're on medication, come off your medication. If you come off your medication, it should be done under the supervision of your doctor, okay? And so, so on to our next protocol. Non-stimulant medication is also used because not everyone responds well to stimulant medications. Behavioral therapy and neurofeedback is shown to be as effective as medication. But again, there's a caveat there because, you know, if you're on medication, you want to make sure that you are working with your doctor and that you're not just coming off your medication cold turkey and thinking that behavioral therapy or neurofeedback will take its place. There's a process, and I encourage you to, you know, give that, to make sure that you have a good understanding as you are sharing this information with your loved ones, okay, or your friends. But again, the behavioral therapy and neurofeedback can be extraordinarily effective. Also, building and reinforcing organizational skills, using visual calendars is also important with regard to structure. Next slide. Okay, so we'll stop here because I want to be able to really talk a little bit about epigenetics. That was something that I mentioned early on in the presentation. So epigenetics refers to biological traits or changes that cannot be explained by a person's genetic code. So we all have our own genetic code, our DNA, okay? Epigenetic mechanisms actually create a physical mark on the DNA when a person undergoes an important experience, whether that experience is positive or negative. And these marks, which can be added, you know, or I should say, adjusted, right, through the individual's gene function, it changes how the genes express themselves. So it doesn't change your DNA, but it changes the expression of the gene, okay? And in a nutshell, environment and experiences affect a human's development and behavior in an enduring fashion, actually altering regions of the DNA with effects that may last for an entire lifetime. You know, this is just a slight pause here, but you've heard people talk about post-slavery syndrome, and you've heard folks talk about how, you know, post-traumatic stress, of course. This is how your epigenetics express themselves in your life, and how those experiences may cause a shift in our body, a shift in our brain. And so with epigenetics, there is hope for people struggling with various conditions, in particular ADHD, because if we're able to help individuals gain more control through therapy, through counseling, through nutrition and diet and supplementation, that can have a very, very positive effect on how their genes begin to express, how their genes begin to actually shift for the positive, okay? How it works is starting with your genes, the building blocks of who we are and who we become. But the beginning at the conception, everyone is exposed to different environmental toxins and advantages. But the beginning and after we're born, psychological inputs like stress, adversity, and even trauma begin to factor in. And epigenetics takes this input and uses it to change how these genes are actually expressed. Meaning a gene's output isn't fully known until environment and personal history are factored in. So for that, there is opportunity to always change your body, to change your brain, right? As long as you're giving your body and your brain what it needs, there's opportunity to change the expression of the genes. You know, I've been told, and many of you have probably heard that, there are diseases that run in my family, and and the thinking now with doctors is because they're finally getting on the epigenetics train, and that is you may have the diabetic gene or the high blood pressure gene or the heart disease gene, but your lifestyle is what pulls the trigger. So you may have the gene, that's the bullet, but lifestyle is what pulls the trigger. And that's in a nutshell what epigenetics is. It's how your lifestyle is able to make alterations in how your genes express themselves. So I'm hoping that is a point of optimism for individuals who are struggling with ADHD or if they have family members, because your genes do not solely determine your fate. It's really a lot to do with the epigenetics. And though genes may make someone more prone to certain diseases or disorders, including ADHD, the entire genetic system is highly dynamic and responsive to input. And this means that it's possible to change that expression by making certain environmental changes. So I think that that hopefully that will give understanding. And what I'd like to do is take some time and take questions and see if we can dig a little bit deeper in our remaining time. There are some foods and nutrients that's going to be in part 2, but I won't just leave you hanging, especially for those who may not be able to come to part 2. One of the biggest supplements, if you will, or sources of food, nutrient, is omega-3 fatty acids. And there's now very significant documentation that fish oil supplements, which come in a variety of nutrients, have been extraordinarily well documented to improve ADHD, meaning that it decreases some of the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, the lack of focus, because omega-3 fatty acids are brain foods. And the brain consists of about 70% fat. And so you want fat for your brain. So some of the greatest sources of omega-3s will be fish, salmon in particular, mackerel as well, sardines, walnuts are another. If you're not a fish lover, walnuts, flaxseed, basil, which is an herb, eggs. Eggs are extremely good for the brain, but you've got to be able to eat eggs, and obviously for fish as well. So if you have no allergies to fish or eggs, those will be two really good go-to foods to support your brain. Brussels sprouts, seaweed, soybeans, spinach, broccoli, and cashews. So these are some of the foods that are very, very high in omega-3s, omega-3 fatty acids in particular, and really good to add to your diet. And another thing about food, there are several things that children in particular with ADHD should never consume, okay? Gluten is one, refined sugar is two, artificial preservatives, three, red dye number 40 is four, and it also talks about dairy. I know that those can be very hard, but this is what some of the new research is saying, that these are actually foods that children with ADHD should not consume because of the negative impact that they have on the brain's function. I'm sure that we can really understand that when it comes to artificial flavorings and preservatives. That would be like the red dye number 40. Gluten, some individuals are gluten sensitive, some actually have a gluten allergy. So not everyone who may be a little sensitive to gluten has an actual allergy. But if you're sensitive, that means that your body is going to have some type of adverse reaction. And so you want to be careful about that. Gluten, unfortunately, is in bread. It's in whole wheat. And so for someone who is gluten intolerant or gluten sensitive, they'd have to find other sources of bread. And there are other sources of bread. You just have to do your research about it. But that's an important piece because gluten really has a very negative impact on your whole body. And there are some individuals in kind of the wellness health space that advocate that you should not consume gluten at all. No one should, because of the negative impact that it has on your body, on your brain's functioning, and on your gut health as well. Refined sugar, I'm sure most of us can understand and identify with that, though we may not agree with it because, we all love a little bit of dessert, but that's what the research is saying right now. So these are just some of the food items that I wanted to be able to share with you. And if there are questions, I want to I'd like for us to engage about it and talk about what your thoughts about ADHD and using nutrients and supplementation. And I will talk about some of the supplements as well. Again, just in case folks can't make it to the part 2, omega-3s or fish oil, that would be a supplement. Magnesium, which is very, very critical for brain function. The same for zinc, the same for iron. It's very important that if you have a child especially, but even adults, get tested. Have your physician test your iron levels. Have them test your, and they can test your nutrient levels. Vitamin D is also very important because anemia, iron anemia is very, very, very common with children who have ADHD. And that's something that's very easy to to fix, very easy to correct. And so the things that you can correct through foods and supplementation most certainly should be done. And it's something that oftentimes you don't have to necessarily take a pill for it. You don't have to necessarily go and buy supplements, but that means that you have to eat these supplement-rich foods. So I just want to take some time now and entertain a couple questions if we haven't.
You have Hakima with her hand raised.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Hi, assalamu alaikum, Hakima.
Walaikum assalam. How are you, Dr. Gloria? Thank you for this very informative presentation. I was a little slow to get my pen, and I wrote down most of the things you said, flaxseed, walnuts, salmon, Brussels sprouts, spinach, and so on. But there were 2 or 3 that you mentioned before flaxseed that I was unable to write down.
Walnuts.
Walnuts.
Okay. Basil. Yeah. And of course, different types of fatty fish, mackerel, salmon, of course, sardines, fatty fish.
Okay. What about trout? Is trout a fatty fish?
Trout's not listed, and I don't know how fatty, honestly, the trout is, but it wasn't listed, but they say specifically mackerel. And again, sardine is a fatty fish.
Okay, and just one more question.
And just one other thing in terms of mercury, because that's also a concern when you are talking about fish. That's why there's so much talk about, limiting tuna because of the mercury exposure. Mackerel and sardines are small fish. And so small fish don't have nearly as much mercury exposure as your larger fish. So if I were going to feed fish to a child, I would look more at mackerel, make it into a salad kind of thing. They may not eat much of sardines, but if they can, and of course, salmon.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. And just one more question: would a good multivitamin contain enough magnesium, zinc, and iron, and some of the other nutrients that you mentioned, or vitamins that you mentioned? Would that be enough, or do you have to take it separately? Okay.
That's an excellent question. That's on part 2, but we'll talk about it now.
Okay.
A multivitamin is absolutely recommended because that's really your base approach, right? So a multivitamin is absolutely recommended, but they often need more. Because a multivitamin is going to give you a broad spectrum, nutritional supplement, approach, but you also want to give a little bit more. But again, it's important to have the child tested because you don't want, no one should be taking in excess the nutrients that any vitamin. You don't want to have it in excess, because that's a problem as well. Not necessarily, it's not necessarily will affect the brain in that way, but your body, you don't want to be in excess when it comes to certain nutrients.
Thank you very much.
Yes, yeah, good questions. I appreciate that, and I hope you got cashews as well. A fatty nut. I'm not sure if I skipped over seaweed or not. And algae, which is a very good source of omega-3s if you're a vegetarian. Any other questions or concerns?
I have a question.
Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Gloria, this is Samira. I got a question about sea moss. A lot of people are starting to take sea moss, and I'm one of them. But I was just wondering, how would this benefit the benefits of sea moss?
Sea moss is not mentioned at all in any of the literature that I reviewed, but that doesn't mean that you can't benefit from it. But with regard to ADHD, it's not mentioned in any of the literature that I reviewed. And I tried to do a pretty thorough search. Yeah, but good question.
Okay.
Good question.
Okay.
Again, with ADHD, it's a lot of fat because the brain has so much fat and you want to feed that brain.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Was there another question?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
For people with like fish allergies and who are unable to take like seaweed or salmon or fatty fish, is a vegan omega-3 fatty acid, would that be something that's considered to be just as effective?
Well, for vegans, algae would be your source. That would be your primary source, because that's supposed to have a really good amount of omega-3s, and that is a vegan source of omega-3. But again, as a vegan, you want to lean into your walnuts, your flaxseed, chia seeds also. That's not on the list, but I know that chia seeds are high in the omega-3s. Okay.
All right, thank you.
Basil, Brussels sprouts, yes, and seaweed. So algae and seaweed. And I recognize.
Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, yes, Brother Bashir.
Bashir, yes. I'm not sure, but I think possibly the identification of ADHD is a new, probably, let's say it's recent. Do we have any historical background, let's say, where ADA in the history of man had been misdiagnosed? I think it's considered now a neurological disease. So my other question is it prevalent among any certain people? Now, quite often, in our country, African Americans, we suffer to a greater extent than other people because of many social factors.
Mm-hmm.
And is there any information where ADHD is not prevalent in a particular society, say outside of the United States, another country that we find that it's not as prevalent? So those are my three questions here.
Yes, yes, yes. Those are excellent questions. So in my research, Asians are the least, are the ethnic group that's diagnosed the least amount. I probably said that in a different way, but they are least diagnosed with ADHD. Asians, Caucasians are they lead in the diagnosis of ADHD, and then African Americans. And so, what the research is suggesting is that, going back to when I talked about the epigenetics and how your environment influences how your genes are expressed. What the research is suggesting is that the experiences, the cultural experiences of many cultural groups impact the, I won't say full development, but development, if you will, of ADHD. So if a parent has ADHD, they can pass that gene on to their child, but that gene does not have to express, right, as it relates to epigenetics. So the environment has a lot to do with that. And and it's not just, I'm not just speaking about home environment, because we're not vilifying anybody, right? We're not saying that there's a bad home environment or anything, but we're talking about all kinds of experiences. Maybe there's, maybe this child is exposed to a lot of stress in the community. Maybe the housing situation is not very positive. Okay, there could be many different reasons from an environmental standpoint, but that can impact epigenetics, right? And so when you just kind of look at the Asian culture, This is a very close-knit culture. Um, they rely heavily on family. Their culture is can be quite different than some of the other cultures that we're familiar with, right? And again, I found it very interesting that this is the group that is diagnosed the least amount with ADHD. And so, and in terms of have people been misdiagnosed? Absolutely, absolutely misdiagnosed. And we know that that can happen with any medical disorder, but yes, it absolutely happens with ADHD. If a child is experiencing stress or even have been traumatized, maybe they experienced bullying in school, or as an adult, maybe they were in a bad relationship, okay? And you actually can present behaviors that will start to look like you are very disorganized, or very inattentive, very distracted, or very, very hyperactive. And so we know that these things can happen, and folks can think automatically, oh, that person has adult ADHD, or that child has ADHD. So yes, people can very much be misdiagnosed based on how they present, and we just have to be able to look further. And I don't want to underestimate the need for medical testing. There is a real role, because this is a medical condition. So there is a real role for medical testing. Now, does it happen a lot? Not as much as it should, because that means that parents have to push the doctors. I want my child tested for their iron level. I want my child tested for their level of omega-3s. I want them tested. And so we have to force that. So did I answer your question?
Yes. One other thing did come to my mind, because I know you were some of the things that could help cure that situation. And I was just thinking, have you in your study, and being a Muslim, have you seen any guidance in al-Islam, our lifestyle, and our practices that would benefit a person with ADHD? Because I'm thinking about our practice of prayer, which
Yes.
requires concentration.
Yes.
And
yes.
Some of our practice and lifestyles that may be beneficial in this area.
Yes.
And that's my last and final question.
Well, an excellent last and final question from you. I absolutely agree with you. Yes. And I think that in all walks of faith, but yes, as Muslims, as Christians, I have a few of my colleagues on who are Christian. Absolutely, faith plays a big role. Your practice of faith, right? Because your practice of faith can help to soothe your own mind, and to now your practice of faith is highly important. I really try to want to stress that as much as possible, but I also know that you have to always be aware of what the science is directing us to do. Okay, and that is that we cannot separate our faith from good diet, from good nutrition, from good practices, right? From good habits. And so, yes, faith is critical. I think that as we practice our faith, as we are going into our prayers, it brings about a great sense of peace that is very soothing to the mind, that is very comforting to your mind. And but oftentimes people lose that ability. If they're struggling with ADHD, they lose that ability for those peaceful practices to transcend into their daily life, right? And that's where you have to be able to lean into your nutrition and your supplements. Okay. Did that answer your question? So yes, faith is highly important. I have a couple questions. One is from Joanne. Could it be the way that they internalize stress and trauma? Yes, very much so. How we internalize is really how those epigenetics begin to express. It's absolutely, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Joanne, did you want to make any comment?
Yeah, I did, because I really didn't know the definition of epigenetics until you defined it. Thank you. But I can agree that has to be somewhat based on how that person, how that family, how that culture internalizes and perceives stress, you know,
Yes.
or their flexibility, their ability to handle the daily life functions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Absolutely. And if you reflect back on our culture as African, you know, most of us are African American on this Zoom. You know, when you have lived in stress, your parents lived in stress, your grandparents lived in stress. That's a lot of epigenetic burden you're carrying, right? That's a lot of epigenetic burden to carry. And so there's no wonder that we see little Black boys struggling in school, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's normalized. It's sort of the stress is thus normalized now.
Exactly.
So how do you handle that? You know, how do you handle that?
So you begin to handle it with, you know, as I talked about, it's leaning into the health and nutrition part, the supplementation, eating, you know, what you're eating, right? And also neurofeedback. And that's something that we'll talk more about in session 2. But the neurofeedback piece is very, very important. You know, as I said at the beginning of this talk, that psychotherapy and neurofeedback are as effective as medication if done properly and consistently. Because that's the caveat. Properly and consistently. Because oftentimes people will start therapy and then they'll stop, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So it has to be proper and consistent. We have to recognize that this is something that I need. You know, it's like drinking water, right? If you go without water so many days, you die. Water is absolute critical element required for your body.
Okay.
So
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let me see. I have, are there any negative effects to medication for ADHD? Yes. There are lots and lots of side effects. I didn't even touch on the side effects because there's just volumes and volumes of papers written about that. And I didn't touch on it because I'm trying to emphasize a holistic approach. But yes, that's the main issue with the medications and with most medications. There comes a side effect. And so children with ADHD in particular, and I'm talking about kids, but this applies to adults as well. But children are the ones who can't speak for themselves. Adults can't. You know, we can go to the doctor and say, hey, this isn't working for me, right? But children can't speak for themselves. So the side effects of stimulant and non-stimulant medications, oftentimes children would get headachy, they'll lose their appetite. So if you lose your appetite, how are you going to be able to consume nutrient-rich foods, right? Children will become lethargic, okay? Children will have body aches. They'll have trouble with sleeping, lots of trouble with sleeping. So that's another point that I'm going to talk about in part 2, the importance of sleep hygiene. And if you are not getting restorative sleep, your body cannot heal itself. So yes, there are lots of side effects to the medications. Again, I am not anti-medication for any condition because I think that that's a very personal decision. I respect it. I respect Western medicine. I just recognize that there has to be a marriage between, holistic and alternative health and Western medicine. There has to be a marriage because I absolutely, as I said, I respect Western medicine, but I also know that with those medications are often lots and lots of side effects, and some people can't tolerate them. Some people, the side effects may be fairly minor, they're okay. Others, if they're very sensitive, they can't tolerate the medications. So yes, just want to check. Any other questions? Well, I thank you all for tuning in. I apologize for the late start, but we had some major, I'm so technically challenged. And so we had some major technical difficulties here, but hopefully we will be able to start on time. Next time, there will be a notice as to when part 2 will be presented. And that's when we will get into very, very specifically about foods, about the nutrients, what the nutrients actually do, right? With regard to ADHD, okay? We would talk, I'll give some real food examples, give some diet examples. And so I'm looking forward to that. So thank you all so very much for tuning in. And I hope to see you again. And if there are no further questions, I will sign off. Any other questions at all? Or if anybody wants to stay behind and ask a question, I'll close the recording, but I'm certainly available to answer any questions that you have, okay? And I'd like to be able to direct folks to resources so that you can kind of, do your own research, if you will. So I'd like to be able to direct folks to that. All right. Well, thank you all. I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to next time.
Thank you.
All right. You're so welcome.
Yes,
Assalamu
thank
alaikum.
you.
Thank you,
Dr. Gloria.
Gloria.
Very good.
Thanks, Gloria.
You are so welcome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate it. And I apologize for starting late. And I will do a closing dua with Allah's name, God's name, the merciful benefactor, merciful redeemer. I pray, oh Allah, oh God, Allah, that you cover and protect all of us, that you bless us all with the knowledge and the discernment to be able to make the best choices for our lives and for the lives of our family members who are in our care. I thank you. Ameen, ameen, ameen.